Hi, my friends. Today I want to present you a new story. Enjoy watching it.
The hum of the washing machine filled the tiny kitchen as Brenda stood by the sink, scrubbing the stubborn remnants of lasagna from the casserole dish. The repetitive motion usually helped clear her mind, but today it only amplified the storm of thoughts raging inside her. "Brenda, you all right?" Francis's voice broke her concentration. He leaned against the doorframe, his tie loosened after another grueling day at the office. His warm, hazel eyes searched her face, but she avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the dish in her hands. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone clipped. She knew he wouldn't press further. Francis had learned that her silence often masked the words she wasn't ready to say. The truth was, Brenda felt anything but fine. It had been 3 years since they decided to try for a baby. 3 years of dashed hopes, invasive tests, and whispered prayers. Each failed attempt chipped away at her confidence, leaving her raw and vulnerable. As she dried the dish and placed it in the cabinet, her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Lindsay, her mother-in-law, lit up the screen. "Dinner tomorrow at 7. Don't be late." Brenda's stomach churned. She could already hear Lindsay's veiled criticisms, the subtle digs about her inability to give Francis what he deserved. "What did she want?" Francis asked, nodding toward the phone. "Just dinner plans," Brenda muttered, stuffing the phone into her pocket. Francis sighed and stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We don't have to go if you don't want to." "We do," Brenda replied, forcing a smile. "It's family." That night, as Brenda lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of unspoken words pressed on her chest. She glanced at Francis, already asleep beside her, his breathing steady and peaceful. For a moment, she envied his ability to compartmentalize, to keep hope alive without letting the fear consume him. She closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Please, let something change." Brenda's hands trembled as she held the pregnancy test, staring at the 2 faint pink lines that had appeared. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to freeze. Could this really be happening? After years of heartbreak, was this finally their miracle? "Francis," she called out, her voice cracking with emotion. She barely heard his hurried footsteps before he appeared in the doorway, his tie askew and his sleeves rolled up. "What is it? Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes darting between her tear-streaked face and the tiny stick in her hand. She held it out, unable to speak, her throat tight with unspoken hope. Francis took the test, squinting at the lines before his face broke into a disbelieving grin. Are you?" "I think so," Brenda whispered, her voice trembling. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as Francis pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he feared she might disappear. "I can't believe it," he murmured into her hair. "After everything, Brenda, we're going to be parents." The rest of the day passed in a surreal haze. Brenda booked an appointment with the obstetrician, her heart racing with anticipation. That evening, as they sat on the couch, Francis couldn't stop smiling. He kept glancing at her, his excitement barely contained. "You've given me the greatest gift," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "Just be here," Brenda replied, resting her hand on his. "That's all I need." The next morning, they visited the doctor, who confirmed the pregnancy with a warm smile. As Brenda watched the tiny flicker of their baby's heartbeat on the monitor, she felt a profound sense of awe. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that happiness was truly within reach. When, after 9 months, Brenda and Francis had their long-awaited son, there was no limit to their joy, and tears of happiness flowed down their cheeks. It was a crisp autumn morning when Brenda and Francis took their newborn son, Matthew, to the clinic for a routine checkup. The sunlight streamed through the large windows of the waiting room, casting soft patterns on the tiled floor. Brenda cradled Matthew, her fingers brushing gently against his tiny hand. Francis sat beside her, flipping through a magazine but clearly distracted. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Brenda asked, her voice tinged with concern. Francis glanced at her, his reassuring smile barely masking his own nerves. "Of course, it's just routine. They'll check for allergies and get his blood type. Nothing to worry about." When their turn came, the nurse led them into a small examination room. Matthew cooed softly as Brenda laid him on the table. The nurse was gentle but efficient, taking a small sample of blood from his tiny finger. Brenda winced at his brief cry, her heart aching with every tear. "You're so brave, sweetheart," she whispered, kissing Matthew's forehead as Francis placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. A week later, the results arrived in a neatly folded envelope. Brenda opened it at the kitchen table while Francis poured coffee. Her eyes scanned the paper until they froze on one section. "Francis," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He set the mug down and walked over, concern etched on his face. "What is it?" She handed him the paper, her hand trembling. "Look at his blood type. It says A." Francis frowned, rereading the document. "That doesn't make sense. We're both type O." The room fell silent. the weight of the revelation pressing down on them. Brenda's mind raced, 1,000 questions swirling in her head. Was there a mistake? Or something more? There has to be an explanation, Francis said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Brenda could only nod, a growing sense of unease settling in her chest. The answer, she knew, would change everything. The evening had an unusual chill, though the heater hummed softly in the living room. Brenda sat on the edge of the couch, the blood test result clutched tightly in her hands. Her mind swirled with questions, fears, and the undeniable need for answers. Francis paced back and forth, his normally calm demeanor fractured. "We need to call my mother," Francis said abruptly, breaking the tense silence. Brenda's head snapped up. "Your mother? Why?" she asked, already suspecting the storm such a call would unleash. She'll know if something's wrong," Francis stammered. "Maybe there's some family history we're missing." Brenda hesitated but finally nodded. She watched as Francis picked up his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed Lindsay's number. The call was brief. Lindsay, always quick to insert herself into their lives, agreed to come over immediately. Half an hour later, Lindsay arrived, her sharp heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She walked in without knocking, her eyes immediately zeroing in on Brenda. "What's so urgent?" Lindsay demanded, her tone curt. She sat down, smoothing her skirt as if preparing for battle. Francis handed her the test result without a word. Lindsay's sharp eyes scanned the paper, her face slowly twisting into a mask of anger. "Type A," she spat, glaring at Brenda. "Explain this." Brenda's voice was steady despite the storm brewing in her chest. "I was hoping you might have an explanation. Both of us are type O. This shouldn't be possible." Lindsay's lips curled into a sneer. "What's there to explain? It's obvious, isn't it?" She turned to Francis. "This woman has betrayed you. She's been unfaithful." "That's enough," Francis's voice thundered, silencing the room. He stepped between Brenda and his mother, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get to accuse my wife without proof." Lindsay stood, her face flushed with indignation. "Proof? The proof is in that test. You think it's some coincidence." "And what if there's another explanation?" Brenda interjected, her voice firm. She reached into a drawer and pulled out another document, Francis's blood test results from the fertility clinic. "This says Francis is type A." Lindsay froze, her eyes darting between the papers. That's impossible," she stammered, her voice faltering. "Your father and I are both type O. Francis should be type O." A heavy silence fell over the room. Francis's gaze hardened as he stepped closer to his mother. "So what does that mean, Mom?" Lindsay's hands trembled, her bravado crumbling. She sank into a chair, her face pale. There's something I need to tell you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And as the truth began to unravel, the air in the room grew colder, each revelation cutting deeper than the last. The room hung in a thick silence as Lindsay's trembling hands gripped the edge of the table. Brenda remained seated, her expression unreadable as she watched Francis's father lean forward. His voice, when he spoke, was low and firm. "Lindsay, it's time to come clean. No more lies." Lindsay's gaze flickered between the faces staring at her, and for the first time, her bravado crumbled. She buried her face in her hands. "I never wanted it to come out like this," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It was years ago, a mistake I tried to forget." "A mistake?" Francis's father's tone was sharp. "You mean the affair?" "Yes," Lindsay confessed, her voice cracking. "It was a moment of weakness. You were always away on business, and I was lonely. Your younger brother was there, always supportive, always attentive. I didn't think it would lead to." Her words faltered as tears streamed down her face. Francis's face was ashen, but he remained composed. "So you're saying Uncle Paul is my biological father?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Lindsay nodded slowly. "Yes, but your father raised you as his own, Francis. He loves you." Brenda reached out, placing a steadying hand on Francis's arm. "We'll get through this together," she said softly, her words offering a glimmer of comfort. Francis's father stood abruptly. "I need some air," he muttered, leaving the room without another word. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house. In the days that followed, Lindsay's confession sent shockwaves through the family. Francis decided to sever ties with his mother, unable to forgive her betrayal. His father filed for divorce, reclaiming his independence after decades of deceit. Despite the upheaval, Francis and Brenda found strength in each other. With their son in Brenda's arms, Francis said, "This is the family that matters now. You, me, and him." Brenda smiled through her tears. "And your father. He's still here for us too." In time, Francis's father embraced his new life, finding solace in his bond with his grandson. As for Lindsay, she faded into the background, her once dominant presence reduced to a memory. Life for Brenda and Francis was no longer about shadows of the past, but the bright promise of their future. Together, they turned the page, ready to write a new chapter filled with love, resilience, and hope.
Friends, What do you think of this story? Write your opinion in the comments. Would you like more stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button so you don't miss any videos. See you tomorrow.